jumbo jet. You know, it takes forever to get people here. Anyway, we're here. You mustn't take that away. If that disappears, I have nothing to say at all.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Katz, and it's my pleasure to introduce our illustrious speaker on Churchill and the Monarchs, Professor Sir David Cannadine. In May 2013, I sat down in the library after dinner with an article called An Imperial Childhood by David Cannadine. The next morning, I would have my last class at Harvard, and reading this article for my course on the British Empire was my last assignment. With the closing of this chapter in my life, I was feeling contemplative as I began to read Professor Cannadine's article. In it, he described his childhood realization that he was growing up in an era of an ending, that his was a generation that hung by its finger ends on the coattails of the British Empire. These poignant words about the sense of an ending resonated deeply that night as I reflected on the end of my journey at Harvard, and more importantly, on this last step across the bridge from childhood to adulthood. And there, in the middle of the library, I began to cry. To this day, reading An Imperial Childhood remains the most moving moment of my student life. I finally met Professor Cannadine in person last year at the Churchill Center's Leadership Awards dinner in New York. Since then, he has kindly rescued me on 2 particularly frustrating spreadsheet-filled days at the office with tea and Churchillian conversation, for which I am most grateful. I'm fortunate to know him not only as a world-class scholar and historian, but also as a tremendous listener, advisor, and font of wisdom. Sir David Cannadine is the Dodge Professor of History at Princeton University, having previously taught at Cambridge, Columbia, and London universities. As the author of 15 books and the editor of 13, Professor Cannadine is perhaps one of few individuals who could rival Churchill's prolificacy. In addition to his writing, teaching, and research, Professor Cannadine served as the chairman of the trustees of the National Portrait Gallery in London, as the general editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and as a fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Historical Society, and the Royal Society for Literature, among numerous other accomplishments. In 2009, he was knighted in the Queen's Birthday Honors for his vast services to scholarship. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, perhaps the only person who could tackle the colossal subject of Winston Churchill and the Monarchs, Professor Sir David Cannadine.
Thank you so much for that exceptionally kind and generous introduction. Since I spend part of my time earning my living by speaking as well as by writing, I have become an unrivaled connoisseur of introductions to myself. Not, it must be said, a fiercely competed for position. And on one occasion, I was lecturing, I was on the road with my autobiography of Andrew Mellon, and I was in Kansas City. And there was an introduction given, and the chairman said, I should like to introduce David Cannadine. He is the author of the greatest biography of Andrew Mellon ever written. And I thought the evening promised well, and rather preened myself a bit. Then came the killer line. He said, it is also, of course, the only biography of Andrew Mellon ever written. So thank you so much for not having said that. Let me begin. It's January 1952. King George VI has just died, and Winston Churchill delivers his last great public broadcast, announcing that news and, of course, acclaiming George VI's successor. In the past 6 weeks, Churchill said, the king walked with death, but when death came, it came as a friend, an acquaintance, whom he recognized and did not fear. And after a long day's sport and a sweet good night to those who loved him best, he fell asleep as every man or woman who fears God and nothing else in the world may hope to do. And he ended as follows: I, whose youth was nurtured in the august, unchallenged, tranquil glow of the Victorian era, may well feel a thrill in invoking once more the prayer and the anthem, God Save the Queen. Well, there was Churchill at his most eloquently devoted in his attitude towards the British monarchy, as epitomised in his late Majesty George VI and her new Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Indeed, according to Clementine Churchill, Winston was the only surviving believer in the divine right of kings, and he took great pride and delight, this is Clementine's words, in being monarchical number one, who valued tradition, form, and ceremony. Churchill's public life, which spanned more than half a century, from the mid-1890s to the mid-1950s, it was a veritable cavalcade of kings and queens, thrones and palaces, coronations and jubilees. By the end of his career, Churchill had been a member of Parliament during the reign of 6 successive sovereigns. He had held office as a cabinet minister under 4 of them, and he was, by a substantial margin, the senior Privy Councillor. King and country in that order, noted Lord Moran, that's just about all the religion that Winston has got. However, what of course is interesting about Winston Churchill and monarchy, as is so interesting about Churchill and all the many other important things he did, is that the subject turns out, on closer examination, to be much more complicated than at first glance we might suppose. Churchill, in fact, had a rather interestingly nuanced view of the institution of monarchy, and his relations with successive occupants of the British throne were themselves rather complicated and rather nuanced. One of Churchill's views of monarchy was that, despite the shortcomings of certain British monarchs, the English throne was a sacred, mystical, almost metaphysical institution, which connected the past, the present, and the future, and which proclaimed the unity and identity of the nation. And part of what the British monarchy was for, in Churchill's view, was to do that. A second view was that while other European nations preferred or suffered kings and queens who were generally despotic and absolute, the British, on the other hand, had evolved a more admirable form of constitutional and limited monarchy. Thanks to Parliament, which represented the nation as a whole, and the later advent of the two-party system, the sovereign's power was progressively eroded in a succession of episodes which were milestones in the advancing cause of national liberties, Magna Carta all the way to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and beyond. The result, according to Churchill, was a happy compromise, a permanent parliament and a docile monarchy, whereby the sovereign reigned above the battle of party, while the Lords and the Commons legislated and the cabinet governed. So the world in which Churchill grew up in the late 19th century, where Queen Victoria was on the throne, was a world where for him monarchy was, in institutional and Tory terms, an enterprise which embodied the nation's history, continuity and identity in its symbolic functions and ceremonial activities. But it was also, in practical and essentially Whig terms, a convenient constitutional device which left the people free to elect their representatives through whom they governed themselves. And in the reign of Queen Victoria, the monarchy acquired 2 further functions. Thanks to the happy home life of Victoria and Albert, it provided a moral example to the nation of decent and dutiful domesticity, in a way that had not been true for much of the time when the Stuarts and the Hanoverians had been on the throne. And Victoria was not only head of the British nation, but also became the great presiding personage of the much wider British Empire. Largely on account of Disraeli's initiative and imagination, hers had become an imperial monarchy, the focus and cynosure of a diverse and far-flung British community extended across the seas and around the world, which was united in fealty and homage to the Queen Empress. Now that monarchy, by turns Tory and Whig, mystical and functional, symbolic and constitutional, individual and familial, national and imperial, was in the full flower of its late Victorian abundance, confidence and ostentation as Churchill was growing up. It seemed an apt expression of the British genius for organic constitutional evolution and working political compromise. It was widely envied around the globe, and in this particular settlement and configuration, it lasted for the whole of Churchill's long life. Our ancient monarchy, he observed on the birth of Prince Charles, renders inestimable services to our country and to all the British Empire and Commonwealth of nations. But Churchill never forgot that while the mystical, unifying, moral and imperial functions of the monarch were important, the whole tenor and tone and dynamic of English history had been to bring about a state of affairs where the king's government was carried on by ministers who were primarily answerable to Parliament rather than to the Crown. The royal prerogative, he insisted to Clementine in 1909, is always advised on the advice of ministers, and ministers, not the Crown, are responsible. And criticism of all debatable acts of policy should be directed to ministers, not to the monarch. So those were Churchill's general views about monarchy, which remained pretty much unchanged for the whole of his life. But how in practice did he interact with particular monarchs? And how far did those views that he had about the balance of power between the monarchy and the politicians inform and in certain cases antagonize his relations with the sequence of sovereigns whom at the end of his life he felt proud, and rightly so, to have served? Edward VII was the first monarch with whom Churchill came into contact as an active and engaged, and as he was in that phase of his life, very energetic and ambitious politician. As he began to make a reputation in his first office as colonial undersecretary, King Edward VII expressed delight that he was becoming, this is Edward's words, a reliable minister and above all a serious politician, which can only be obtained by putting country before party. I am, he went on, watching your political career with the greatest of interest. But while Edward certainly did watch young Winston's early political career with great interest, he increasingly felt that Churchill was headed in the wrong direction. His drive, brashness, ambition, opportunism, self-absorption and egotism soon grated on his sovereign. And by the end of the 1900s, by the end of Edward VII's reign, Churchill was at his most radical political phase, supporting Lloyd George over his people's budget, over increasing tax, and in his hostile comments about the House of Lords. All of this seemed to Edward VII both anathema in terms of what was being said, and it suggested to him that Churchill had indeed abandoned the country and was now putting his party and his own career first. The very idea, one of Edward VII's secretaries wrote, of Churchill acting from conviction or principle is enough to make anybody laugh. And Edward VII's anxiety about Churchill's political conduct and character lasted to the end of his life and the end of his reign. And not surprisingly, his successor, George V, although recognizing, as everybody had to do, Churchill's zeal and energy and in some senses undeniable brilliance, he was also influenced by his father's disapproval and generally in the early years of his reign, beginning in 1910, thought Churchill irresponsible and unreliable. And those critical views were strengthened when Churchill moved to be First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill in that role was in one sense a party politician, in another sense a very zealous and creative and engaged reformer. The King, George V, was himself, of course, a former naval person. He was head of the armed services, and he was a staunch believer in tradition and precedent. And Churchill and the monarch rubbed each other up the wrong way over a whole set of sometimes trivial, sometimes more important issues. Churchill, for example, had the bright idea, but not the very tactful idea, of wanting to name a ship HMS Oliver Cromwell. Not surprisingly, George V took violent exception to thus commemorating the regicide. Churchill then had the idea of calling a ship HMS Pitt. But George V, who was not unacquainted with quarterdeck language, thought of the sort of words with which that might rhyme and concluded that that wasn't a very good idea either. I have, Churchill wrote rather stuffily in reply, I have always endeavoured to profit from any guidance His Majesty has been graciously pleased to give me. He wrote rather stiffly after that second royal rebuff. But there were more important issues too. In May 1912, Churchill decided that British battleships should be withdrawn from the Mediterranean and relocated in the North Sea, pending what was going to become quite soon the war with Germany. The King disapproved. Churchill exploded to his wife. The King talked more stupidly about the Navy than I have ever heard him do before. Really, it is so disheartening to hear this cheap and silly drivel with which he lets himself be filled up. Churchill did not give way on that issue and in the end, in fact, prevailed. So what is going on in this first phase of Churchill's political career and his relations with the first two monarchs that he served was that all was not well. Edward VII and George V disliked Churchill because they thought he was insufficiently respectful of their person, their position, and their prerogative. He thought his views were right and theirs were wrong, and they didn't like that. Churchill, for his part, was unintimidated and objected to what he regarded as inappropriate royal interference in matters which were wholly within the realm of Parliament and government and the cabinet and politicians. All of that, in turn, meant that when Churchill fell over the Dardanelles disaster in 1915, that news was greeted at Buckingham Palace with scarcely concealed relief, bordering on effusive expressions of joy and pleasure. It is, Queen Alexandra informed her son George V, all that stupid, young, foolhardy Winston Churchill's fault, which has upset almost everybody. And George V took essentially the same view. Churchill had become, he said, impossible, a real danger, and he was delighted and relieved that he had now been got out of harm's way. So then ended the first phase of Churchill's involvement with the British Crown, a very different set of stories and relationships than that embodied in that ardently loyal and eloquent speech with which I started. So how do we get, as it were, from here to there? What is the process whereby Churchill's views of monarchy become very different, as exemplified in his words about George VI and about Queen Elizabeth? The answer, I think, is as follows. During the interwar years, Churchill's attitudes towards monarchy, both in Britain and abroad, began to change as the balance between criticism and approval, hostility and appreciation, shifted markedly in their favour. What's the explanation for that? Like many pre-1914 liberals, the First World War had left Churchill saddened and uncertain, not only with his own personal and political reputation damaged and his career prospects diminished, but also looking out on a social, political, and international landscape so brutally transformed and disturbed that it bore little resemblance to what seemed, at least in retrospect, to have been the Edwardian era of the Belle Epoque, with its settled values and historic institutions. Injuries, Churchill later wrote, injuries were wrought to the structure of human society, which a century will not efface, and which may conceivably prove fatal to the present civilization. And especially at the top of their list of those injuries had been the destruction and overthrow of the ruling royal houses of Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. It's important, therefore, to notice that when Churchill came in the 1920s and early 1930s to write his book, The World Crisis, it was not only, though it was primarily, an enterprise in self-justification for his part in the Dardanelles campaign, but it was also an elegy for this vanished civilization of crowns and thrones and dominations. Nations and empires, he wrote there, crowned with princes and potentates, rose majestically on every side, lapped in the accumulated treasures of a long peace. The old world in its sunset glory was fair to see. That was Churchill on this royal world before 1914, which the First World War had then brought to an end. Those post-war changes in continental circumstances and in Churchillian perceptions and sensibilities help explain the dramatic and complete transformation in his attitude to and his relationships with King George V. For by this time, Churchill no longer regarded the British sovereign as the ignorant, blimpish reactionary of his earlier radical liberal days, but on the contrary, as the embodiment of decency, duty, continuity and tradition in a world too often characterized by strife, anarchy, revolution and chaos. And by the same token, the king now began to warm to Churchill as both an old friend and the new conservative that by the early 1920s he had become. And at exactly that point in the early 1920s, Churchill and George V were much involved in the process whereby Ireland was partitioned, the South became quasi-independent, and they seemed to get along a great deal better after that particular episode where they much warmed to each other. So by the 1920s, and even more by the 1930s, Churchill passionately came to believe that monarchy was hugely important. And in 1934, he wrote an article entitled, "Will the World Swing Back to Monarchies?" And he answered the question he hoped in the affirmative. Monarchy, he argued there, was the best antidote to anarchy on the one side and tyranny on the other. It provided glamour, splendor, restraint, and stability. It was a silly idea that republics were better governed than kingdoms. The 20th century holocaust of crowns had been a huge folly, and the restoration of the historic royal houses in Germany and in the successor states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was something to hope for, to work for, and to look forward to. Churchill developed those themes that what had gone wrong with Europe during the 1920s and 30s was the disappearance of these great monarchies which had held the continent together. He developed those themes more fully in an obituary notice of King George V, which he subsequently revised, extended, and reprinted in Great Contemporaries. In the course of the reign, he argued there, massive changes had destabilized the world. Empires and monarchies had fallen, dictatorship and anarchy had flourished, democracy had become incontinent, unfettered, and irresponsible. Yet, he went on, at the heart of the British Empire, there was one institution among the most ancient and venerable which, so far from falling into desuetude or decay, had breasted the torrent of events and even derived new vigor from the stresses of contemporary life. Unshaken by the earthquakes, unweakened by the dissolvent tides, though all be drifting, the royal and imperial monarchy stands firm. This, he went on, was an achievement so remarkable, a fact so contrary to the whole tendency of the age, that it could not be separated from the personality of the good, wise, and truly noble king whose work now is ended. Note how different that view was of George V from what Churchill had said about him back in 1912. And so, of course, to Edward VIII, and a rather large hiccup in the story of Churchill's reconciliation with monarchy in this later part of his life. When Edward VIII acceded to the throne, Churchill wrote one of these grandiose Disraelian-like letters, which was the mode he used in corresponding with his sovereign, offering his faithful service and heartfelt wishes that a reign which has been so nobly begun may be blessed with peace and true glory, and that in the long swing of events, your Majesty's name will shine in history as the bravest and best beloved of the sovereigns who have worn the island crown. Churchill was quite often good at predicting the future, but it must be said he didn't do all that well on that occasion. Those hopes were sincere and heartfelt, and rested on an exaggerated sense of the king's virtues and a blind eye turned to his faults, both his political attitudes in terms of his support for appeasement and, of course, the conduct of his private life. Churchill then decided that he would take the king's side against the government over the abdication, thereby allying himself with his old friend, the legendarily mischievous Lord Beaverbrook, and seeking to embarrass Baldwin and the national government. Many people took the view that this was a blatantly self-interested act on Churchill's part. That is not, I think, the whole story. He was certainly happy to embarrass Baldwin's government, but I think he genuinely sympathised with the human dilemma of Edward VIII. Could he manage to reconcile a wish for personal happiness and fulfilment with the imperious demands of public duty? With Baldwin's knowledge and indeed consent, Churchill rallied the king, writing him letters, visiting him at Fort Belvedere, seeking to boost his morale and urging him to be discreet in his relationship with Mrs. Simpson. And he tried to play for time in Parliament out of fear that undue pressure or excessive haste might lead Edward to make the wrong decision, abdication and marriage, and in the hope that given time and chance, he might put public duty before the demands of personal gratification. It's very important to stress, given what period we're in, the second half of the 1930s, that in thus championing, however loyally, King Edward VIII, Churchill did his own reputation untold harm with the public, with politicians, and with the court. In a period of mounting tension and anxiety, his plea for extra time was derided by many as patently unrealistic. He failed to appreciate that Edward had already made up his mind to give up the throne for the woman he loved, and he seriously misjudged both the character of the sovereign and the mood of the country, which turned decisively against the king. So much so that when, on the 7th of November in the House of Commons, he pleaded for extra time and that no irrevocable decision should be immediately taken, he was essentially shouted down. Clementine, whose judgment, of course, was often better than Winston's, had always taken the view that supporting Edward VIII was not a good idea. And after witnessing the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey, Winston admitted to Clementine, "You were right. I see now the other one would not have done." And he published an effusive article on the new monarch in the Strand magazine in May 1937. But it's important to notice that as a consequence of having supported Edward VIII, Churchill was scarcely persona grata with the new King George VI and the new Queen or the new court. And that preposterous scene in the King's Speech, which some of you may have seen, where Churchill is seen cozying up to George VI and offering him wise advice, and George VI is delighted to take it, is utterly made up and completely fictitious. I know, here's a rather interesting letter that George VI wrote soon after he became George VI. "I know how devoted you have been and still are to my dear brother." A rather shrewd and perceptive observation. George VI and Queen Elizabeth had heartily loathed Wallis Simpson and regarded any supporters of hers and any supporters of Edward VIII as enemies of theirs. What is more, to these pro-Edward and Wallis delinquencies, which Churchill, of course, above all, embodied, they were further compounded by the fact that Churchill was implacably anti-Chamberlain and anti-appeasement, whereas the new king and the new queen, by contrast, were devoted supporters of the Prime Minister. They shared with him a strong sense of decent moral values. They invited him onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace after he returned, bearing what was claimed to be peace with honour from Munich. And so when Chamberlain resigned on the 10th of May 1940, George VI told him he had been grossly unfairly treated and greatly regretted his going, while Queen Elizabeth wrote to him saying, "How deeply I regretted your ceasing to be Prime Minister. I can never tell you in words how much we owe you." Put the other way, that meant that when Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, it was an appointment which George VI and Queen Elizabeth bitterly opposed. And the fact that Churchill immediately insisted, despite firmly expressed royal misgivings, on making the dreaded Lord Beaverbrook Minister of Aircraft Production and the no less unrespectable Brendan Bracken a Privy Councillor only seemed to confirm the establishment's worst fears, namely that the gangsters and the crooks were now in charge of the nation's affairs. And true to his old cavalier ways, the new Prime Minister was not always scrupulous in keeping the King informed, and he was often infuriatingly unpunctual for royal audiences or luncheons. So things did not begin well. Indeed, it would be fair to say that they began pretty badly. Nevertheless, their relations gradually improved. As the war proceeded, Jock Colville would later write, the King and Queen became as devoted to Winston as he consistently was to them. George VI soon came to recognise the vigour and brilliance and sheer indispensability of his wartime leadership. I must confess, he wrote, when giving permission in July 1941 for Churchill to leave the country to meet FDR off the coast of Newfoundland, that I shall breathe a great sigh of relief when you are safely back home again. And although titanically busy, Churchill did his best to keep his sovereign informed about the war and regularly lunched with him at Buckingham Palace. In 1941, George VI personally appointed Churchill Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, a great expression of confidence in him. And so close did their friendship become that when Churchill wrote his wartime memoirs, he noted with pride that as a convinced upholder of constitutional monarchy, I valued as a single honour the gracious intimacy with which I, as First Minister, was treated, for which I suppose there has been no precedent since the days of Queen Anne and Marlborough during his years of power. Churchill's view being, of course, that the best possible arrangements for governing Britain and fighting wars was that there should be Churchills in power in close alliance with the monarchy. And all things considered, that doesn't seem a wholly foolish view. Nevertheless, it's important to notice that while Churchill's faith and devotion were as sincerely felt as they were eloquently expressed, he hadn't obtained supreme political power with any intention of sharing any of it with his sovereign. He kept the king fully supplied with the appropriate papers and was impressed by his thorough mastery of them, but they were for information only. From the outset, Churchill paid great attention to parliamentary opinion. He regularly, if reluctantly, deferred to his chiefs of staff, and in the later stages of the war, he found it increasingly difficult to get his way with Roosevelt or with Stalin. But as his intransigence over the appointments of Beaverbrook and Bracken had signalled early on, he never changed his mind on a major matter of wartime policy or personnel at the behest of his sovereign. On VE Day, the 8th of May 1945, Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. And soon after, he moved a loyal address to the King in the Commons. We have, he observed, the oldest, the most famous, the most honoured, the most secure and the most serviceable monarchy in the world. And by then, so good were relations between George VI and Churchill that the monarch was deeply dismayed to lose whom he called my dear Winston in the 1945 general election, as reluctant to see him go as he had been reluctant to see him arrive 5 years before. I was shocked at the result, and I thought it most ungrateful to you personally after all your hard work for the people, he wrote, with a fine indifference to the constitutional conventions of impartial royal comment. I shall miss your counsel to me more than I can say. And he offered Churchill the Garter, which he turned down. Why Churchill said, should I accept the order of the Garter when the people have given me the order of the boot? On Churchill's final return to power in October 1951, the king was as delighted to see him back as he had been dismayed when Churchill first showed up at Buckingham Palace back in 1940. In Winston's approach to the throne, Lord Moran reported, his sense of history invested the monarch with a certain mystique, so that he always spoke of the royal house with touching reverence, and never more so than in that eloquent broadcast on the death of King George VI that I've already alluded to. It's a very interesting broadcast, not only because it's a marvellous example of Churchill's late eloquent style, but also because although it is true that Churchill praises George VI for his dedication to duty and his mastery of the business, he never suggested that the king actually made any serious impact on government policy. George was, of course, followed by Queen Elizabeth II. And the ageing Prime Minister now saw himself as playing Lord Melbourne to her, as it were, young Victoria. He was the experienced world statesman with an authority matchless and unrivalled. She, by contrast, was the young sovereign new to her great responsibilities. He wore a frock coat and a top hat for their increasingly lengthy weekly audiences. They talked about polo, horses, and his early life as a subaltern in India, and he returned overflowing with her praises. The Queen was enormously fond of and admiring of her first Prime Minister. She enjoyed his company at Balmoral. She gave him the Order of the Garter that he had earlier refused. And they used to go racing together, racing their horses against each other, sometimes the Prime Minister's winning, sometimes the Queen's winning, a world it is impossible to imagine in existence today. Among the greatest pleasures of Churchill's second premiership were the opportunities that it gave him to give public expression to his romantic, chivalric feelings for the institution of monarchy and for the person of the new monarch. When saluting Elizabeth's succession, he hoped her reign would witness a golden age of art and letters and a brightening salvation of the human scene. On the evening of her coronation, he described the sovereign as crowned in our history and enthroned in our hearts. She was, he went on, a lady who we respect because she is our queen, and whom we love because she is herself. Small wonder that on Churchill's 80th birthday, the whole royal family brought him a present of 4 silver wine coasters. "You have been and are such an inspiration to our people," the Queen Mother wrote in congratulation, "and we are all very proud of you," a complete and conspicuous reversal of the hostile opinion she had entertained of him back in 1940. Her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, got on well with Churchill, remained in touch with him after he'd ceased to be Prime Minister. And her appreciative affection for her first and favourite Prime Minister were fully displayed on his death in January 1965, when she behaved impeccably. For it was at her instruction and with Parliament's acquiescence that Churchill was given a state funeral, arrangements which represented a conspicuous reversal of the previous occasion when Parliament had to petition the extremely reluctant Queen Victoria to accord a similar honour to Gladstone, whom of course she loathed. Setting aside all precedent and precedents, Elizabeth II attended in person the funeral of her greatest subject, as did almost the entire royal family, along with the kings of Belgium, Norway, Greece and Denmark, Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, and the Grand Duke of Luxembourg. Indeed, one of the most memorable images of that day was of the sovereigns and princes of Europe gathered together in a royal tableau on the steps of St. Paul's, saluting Churchill's coffin as it was borne away. Well, let me try to bring this rather rapid canter through a variety of reigns to an end. As with so many aspects of Churchill's public life and political career, his relations with monarchs, both British and foreign, was a uniquely rich and varied story which unfolded at several different levels. At one level, there was a high rhetorical plane of history, drama, romance and sentiment, only equalled among British prime ministers by Disraeli and, more briefly, by Rosebery. From this grandiloquent and dynastic perspective, Churchill regarded successive British sovereigns as national symbols and imperial icons, whose affairs he was proud to conduct and whose encouragement, recognition and admiration he deeply cherished. But in terms of his day-by-day dealings with a succession of monarchs, the position wasn't quite the same. The views that he entertained of Edward VII, of George VI, of Edward VIII, certainly changed over time. And the views that they entertained of him, very much on a par with the views of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, also changed very greatly over time, sometimes from friendship to disapproval, sometimes in the opposite direction. Above all, it was crucial to remember that Churchill was convinced that it was the duty of the sovereign to act in accordance with the advice of his ministers. And Churchill never wavered in that belief. He was willing to give way on small and relatively insignificant matters. But on all great issues, the personnel of politics, domestic statecraft, the grand strategies of war and peace, he was determined to get his way. And as Philip Ziegler once rightly noted, it is hard to think of a single instance in which Churchill changed his views or his course of action on any important question in accordance with his perception of the wishes of the monarch of the time. Finally, and another level and another layer of this complicated, interlocking story, Churchill did come increasingly to believe in the disturbed and troubled 1920s and 1930s that monarchy, if properly undertaken, properly practiced by the incumbent of the throne, did provide the best guarantee of stability, decency, freedom and democracy in a world ever more disfigured by the twin evils of fascism and communism. No such institution, Churchill once told Lord Moran on the accession of Elizabeth II, pays such dividends as the monarchy. And by the end of his life, Churchill was not only the chief shareholder in the British monarchy, he was chairman of the board as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have just been told by the timekeeper-in-chief over here that we have 5 minutes for questions. So, who would like to start? Don't be discouraged. We have a question over here. Oh, that way. You're going in the wrong direction. That way. Yeah, that way.
I think you're there anyway. Do you think that America would be better off if it had a monarch at the present time?
Although it is true that I pay my taxes in this country, I still feel I am a devoted and appreciative guest in this country, and I therefore think it is for others to decide about that, not me. One moment, over there.
There is the 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples. And does Churchill inadvertently betray his feelings about various monarchs he dealt with in dealing with the historical monarchs in that 4-volume set?
Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples is a hugely interesting work. Of course, it was written originally in the late 1930s, but not published until the late 1950s. Of course, it stops in 1900, so, as it were, there's nothing in there about Churchill's own role playing on the stage of human history. He'd written about that in lots of other books. But what is hugely interesting from my point of view about the history of the English-speaking peoples is his comments on the earlier monarchs. Who he thinks are good guys and who he thinks are bad guys, how he treats the evolution of monarchy towards this system of a constitutional monarchy where the politicians govern in the name of the monarch, but the monarch reigns but doesn't rule. So those books are hugely interesting about his views on the history of monarchy. And of course it is an amazing thought that here is somebody who had been running Britain for quite a long time who had actually written a history of Britain. What would we give, as it were, for Stalin's history of Russia or Donald Trump's history of America or whatever it might be. One more question. One more question? Yep, of course.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, very much for your comments right now. My name is John Del Pino. Like yourself, my family was originally guests to this country. We were citizens a long time ago. I just have one comment briefly and a question for you about your talk right now. First off, thank you very much for acknowledging Queen Elizabeth II. As someone who got introduced vicariously to the royal family through my mom's great devotion to the royal family from far away, I happened to name my sister Elizabeth after her when I was a young boy. My comment, though, is this. You mentioned some of the quotations from Churchill in the 30s and so forth, and I'm wondering if you can comment, I'm sure you must know, on Churchill's very interesting introduction forward to my early life when he says, I was a child of the Victorian era when I thought the foundations were firmly set. If you mind commenting that, those immediate 2 paragraphs after that. Thank you.
Yes, My Early Life, again, of course, is a hugely important book because it's terribly self-revealing, it's very funny, and it's beautifully written. And certainly he's writing it in 1929 when the world is about to go to ruin again. And not unreasonably, he was rather attracted with what seemed from that worrying standpoint that what appeared to be the greater stability of the 1890s and the early 1900s. And of course, as you all remember, that book ends with that wonderful sentence, I married and lived happily ever after. And I think we should now go to lunch and live happily ever after there.
Thank you, Sir David, for another excellent presentation to a Churchill conference. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for lunch, so quick housekeeping for our student guests. Your lunch is going to be in the New Jersey room on the 2nd floor at that end of the building. For our registered guests, lunch is across the hall to the left when you go out the doors. There will be a short program during lunch, and then we will resume the main program here in this room again at 1 p.m. Thank you.